Today, I'm honored to sit down with a true legend of the low end, Mr. Roy Vogt. How many people can say they've played everywhere from the Montreux and Montreal jazz festivals to the London Palladium, the Kremlin, and even MTV's Headbangers Ball, dude? Dude, Roy's career spans over 40 years, cutting across genres from punk to funk, country to hyper jazz, and everything in between. He was the first person ever to receive a master's degree in electric bass performance from the University of Miami, and over his incredible career, he has performed or recorded with icons like Larry Coryell, Victor Wooten, Dave Weckl, Chet Atkins, Dickey Betts, Tony Joe White, Charlie Daniels, and the list goes on and on. Beyond his playing, Roy has shaped the next generation of professional musicians as bass professor at Belmont University since 1983, mentoring students who have gone on to play with some of the biggest names in music. Today, I present to you Mr. Roy Vogt.
Thanks. I've had a great time. We'll see you next time.
See you later, dude.
Just kidding.
Man, I'm so glad to get you on here. And you are one of those guys that when I moved to Nashville, and I was just a punk kid, and it came from LA, and you were one of those names of bass players that, back then Nashville was a small town, and there was probably 5 guys that were the top name guys, and you were in that top 5 list as far as pro bass players. And man, I'm just glad we got to play a few gigs there towards the end of my time in Nashville.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that was great. I only wish we'd done more. I had such a good time.
Yeah, man. Well, you never know. Things could happen, right?
Absolutely.
So, man, I want you to guide this interview because, first of all, we're going to start with for all the metalheads and 80s people that watch my channel. Here's something that struck me when we were hanging out on one of those gigs that we did. I remember I was talking about something and you overheard and you said, "That sounds like the Rainbow out in LA," or "That sounds like something that would go down at the Rainbow." And so I go, wait a minute, does he know about, all that stuff out there? So you were actually on MTV Hard and Heavy and Begin.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and actually the way that I got there, like everybody else in that band, was through Memphis, because I had actually just come off the road with the Country Act, and this was 87. I had toured with John Schneider, and this was an album called You Ain't Seen the Last of Me. And there's videos of that era, and John's like, he's let his hair grow long, and he's in ripped jeans. I remember we were on tour, and we saw Bon Jovi. We had like VIP passes or after the show or whatever, and we saw their whole thing at the Salt Palace in Salt Lake City. And John was just looking, oh, I want to do that. So the whole tour, we got rockier and rockier and rockier. But at the end of all of that, basically when I was done with that, there was one thing that happened to me immediately upon getting off the tour. And it was that I was sitting at home and I got a call from Mel Tillis. And Mel, he left a message on my answering machine. And at that point in 1987, that was the highest paid gig in Nashville.
Wow.
But those guys were party animals. And so I was like, I don't think I really want to be out there with these guys. And so I thought, I can't turn it down, but if I wait long enough, he'll find somebody. And sure enough, I called back later in the afternoon and they had found a guy named Kevin Grant, who eventually his nickname became Swine, and he became like one of the session guys in town in the early 2000s. But that's one of those odd little things where I was like, yeah, I don't think I want that. But there was a friend of mine, Mika Apple, who's a singer-songwriter, and they were wanting to audition for this band out of Memphis, and the front lady and writer was a lady named Joanna Dean Jacobs, and they had done an album, they produced it. It was Eli Ball from Jason and the Scorchers, and then there was an attorney that was working with Eli. And so they had this act called Joanna Dean and the Big Noise. So, I went, like everybody else, I went down to the Union and auditioned. And fortunately for me, John Schneider was like a gym rat. And so if you were going to be on the road with him, you would either be a partier or you'd be a gym rat. So, I was like, I wasn't really a partier. So I just went to the gym with John and his bodyguard and whatever. And I roomed with his bodyguard, who was like a weightlifter bodybuilder guy. And so I just kind of got caught up in that. So fortunately, I looked good when I auditioned for the gig. I got the gig. And, we went to Max Sinnott Sound in Los Angeles in 1987. And we shot the first Kiss This video. If you look online, it'll be Joanna Dean Kiss This LA version. And there is there's a whole storyline of it, and it's real LA from 87. It looks like it could be something off of Married with Children. It's awesome.
Yeah.
But anyway, the record company, well, when we were doing the shoot, there was a guy that was running around, and it was Denny Tedesco. It was Tommy's son. And I had met Tommy in 82 or 83 when he came to, might have even been earlier, he came to Music Man, which was an old music store in Nashville, and he did a clinic, I think, for Yamaha. And there's all these guitar players sitting around, and Tommy had handed out something with a lot of written notation in it. And he said, "Who can read all this?" And I, held up my hand. There were about three other guys. He said, "What do you play?" And they went around the room. And I said, "Well, what do you play?" And I said, "Well, I'm a bass player." And he said, "You mean to tell me I got a room full of guitar players and the only guy who can read, one of the three guys who can read this is the bass player? Come on." But anyway, Denny was he was kind of the grip. He was the guy that was pushing the cart with the steady cam and all that stuff. The thing I remember about that video was that we started, I think, at like 10 in the morning. We weren't done till like probably 10 at night. I woke up the next day and my neck and my shoulders were hurting because I had consistently been banging my head for the shoots and the reshoots and the reshoots for like 10 hours.
Yeah.
It was crazy. But then they didn't like it. We went to, and the Hard N Heavy video, that was done in New York. There was a club there. It wasn't the Roxy in LA, but it was the Roxy in New York. And we went up there and I was sick. I had if I look a little pale in that video, I had either the flu or a really bad cold, and I had to go to the doctor, and I got a shot of B12 and a shot of antibiotic. And they I kind of crawled on the plane, went there, was there all day, and they did they did all the big hair stuff and all that. They boofed us all up, and I was in black leather and all that. And I got after the I got done with the shoot, and I went to my hotel room and just collapsed because it was like, once again, when you do a video like that, it looks really fun, but the reality is that you're doing it, especially those old 80s MTV and CMT videos, you're doing stuff over and over and over and over again, and having to kind of act like you're having a great time. And it's its own thing in a way. I wish it were still there. I don't, there is no music video television at all now, but it was fun. I'm glad I did that. But we we were there peripherally, and I remember we went to she was on Polygram, and so we went to their offices, and I think even did an interview with a guy named Rob Tannenbaum, I think was one of the writers for Rolling Stone at the time. and they showed us like some of the new LA bands that were coming out, and it was like Zodiac Mind Warp and the Love Reaction was one. LA Guns was another one. So it was like, and this was pre Guns N' Roses.
Wow.
So this was like in 87, very early 88. And so, we were one of about 3 or 4 bands that they signed and, did little promotional tours and promoted. And it all came down to what was going to happen with radio play.
Yeah.
Because that was a thing back then. And so in our case, one of the things that they kept saying is, well, you guys are probably going to get the Monsters of Rock tour. But it was down to who was going to chart first. And there was a band called Kingdom Come. And the guy, it was kind of like Greta Van Fleet. You heard Get It On.
It was Zeppelin.
It was Zeppelin. And that was the whole spiel. And actually, I have a friend here in town who actually auditioned for that gig. And he was like, oh, yeah, that was exactly. It was like one guy's concept. And, and unfortunately, that meant they got the Monsters of Rock tour. We got the club tour in the States with the Dodgy Van. It was us, Kingdom Come, and Dan Reed Network. Those were the 3 that were up. And Dan Reed Network was this great band. They were kind of like Prince.
Yeah, they were good.
They were very, very good. And unfortunately, they once again, that radio traction back then was really important. And we didn't, we did well in Nashville because Joanna was from around here. And, so Nashville and Memphis, we did great with. But that's not the rest of the country.
Yeah.
So.
And that's there's a few points you just made there that I want to circle and highlight for our students out there. And no pun intended, because you are a professor, but you mentioned the B12 shots. I can remember when I was a kid playing a dive bar in Virginia, and our roadie was an ex-Molly Hatchet roadie. And he was telling me about the B12 shots. Before they do their live album, the doc would all come and give them the shots so they'd get up on stage and have tons of energy and sound like they've been getting sleep when they probably hadn't been getting sleep. And then the whole getting the airplay. And that's, back then there wasn't as much control. There was control over the playlists, but it hadn't been conglomerated into 2 or 3 companies. So if the band had gotten picked up and gotten a lot of airplay off of your single, then you would have placed higher than Kingdom Come. And the only reason why Kingdom Come really got that slot was they sounded like Led Zeppelin. And there was also Bonham came out about the same time, which also sounded like Led Zeppelin. I don't know if you remember that band.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And that is a very radio-friendly classic rock sound to copy Zeppelin. You guys had more of a unique sound because you had an almost Janis Joplin sounding front woman.
Oh yeah, it was, and in the right circumstance, it should have gone, because the guitar player Steve Engel, who's a very dear friend of mine still to this day, Steve was like, he could totally channel Angus Young. Roger Cox was a great drummer. It was a really powerful band, and she was a great singer and a great writer. But the thing that everybody has to remember with this stuff is that most of your competition are exactly the same. They are great singers, great writers, hopefully great material, because a song, at the end of the day, what's going to make something work or not is a song. And you know that. You were here in Nashville for 30 years, and I've been here for 40. If the song's not there, it doesn't matter how good you are.
Yeah. Yeah. But in reality, after hearing, and I heard Kiss This for the first time the other day when you sent it to me, but I can remember that better than I can remember whatever Kingdom Come came out with back then.
It was something that sounded like Cashmere, and it was called Get It On.
Okay. And here's what's would have changed this entire interview is I was actually at the Monsters of Rock show in LA. If you'd have been on that show, opening that show, we'd be talking about that day right now.
Exactly. Well, and we did get a couple of good licks in. We did. They flew us over to London, and we played the Marquee Club, which was like a really big deal for me because I was one of those kids that went out and bought Who Live at Leeds.
Wow.
And there's that black and white poster of Peter Townsend, from about 1963 with his Rick, and it says the Who Maximum R&B Marquee Club. So I'd been seeing that stuff since I was 14 years old, and so that was a big deal. And then we did we went over to the Midfins Music Festival in Denmark. There were two big Danish festivals. There's one that's called Roskilde, which is like huge.
Yeah.
And we went to that as basically spectators. We went with the record company people or whatever. Midfins was a smaller one, but there was still like 50 or 60,000 people there. And it was crazy. And I think that a little bit of what that was like, we flew over in some little, Embraer jet or something. And I noticed as I'm getting on, there's this kind of rumpled, sort of grumpy looking guy, and it's Van Morrison.
Wow.
So I'm like, oh gosh, that's Van Morrison. So he was playing. And then when we got to the hotel room, in Odense, I turned on the TV, and there was Stevie Ray Vaughan playing.
Wow.
But the coolest thing that happened to me on that trip happened before I even got there. We got into Copenhagen. We were there for a day or two. We were going to rehearse and then go over to Midfins to Odense and do that. But I'm sitting there checking in the hotel, and I'm in my rock and roll regalia with, way more hair than I have now, and ear cuffs and like scarves and stuff. And I look over, and there is Joe Pass. And Joe Pass is hard to miss because Joe is like, he looks like Mel Blanc.
Yeah.
Or he did. And so I'm looking at him, I went, oh my gosh, you're Joe Pass. And, I did my apologetic jazz player playing a rock gig, song and dance. Yeah, well, I went to North Texas State. I'm really, a really trained jazz player, but I'm really and he just stopped me. He said, no, that's wrong. You have a gig. You're working. You have no idea how lucky you are to be out here doing what you do with a gig. Good for you. And I was like, and he said, I'm playing at I think they had a jazz club over at Tivoli Gardens, and he said, I'll put you, and if your band wants to come, I'll put you on the list at the door. And I went over there, and it was him and Lee Honets. So it was like sax and bebop guitar all night. And,
was that mind blowing?
That was amazing. He was one of there's a bunch of, I've gotten to see a lot of good guitar players in my life because I kind of secretly wish I played guitar, and I did for a while when I was a teenager. But, I realized I was better served to go ahead and lean into the bass and let the guitars go, but so that being the case, I was always listening to, guys like Joe. When I was a 19-year-old kid, I was in a fusion band in Texas, and we would do co-bill shows with Larry Coryell.
Wow.
And this was like, and Larry would do like a solo set, and we would do the opening act with a full band. And then Larry would do a solo set, and then we would play together at the end of the night because we knew a lot of his stuff. So, I'm a 19, 20-year-old kid hanging out, playing Larry Coryell music with Larry Coryell, going, God, this is crazy, And,
that is.
But, from there, it was like, because of the era, it was, listening to John McLaughlin, which was he was of that same school. And then, like a lot of guys, because I was a 70s kid in music school, and that was kind of like when all the session guys would cut their solo albums. So I can remember getting Larry Carlton's second record, not the first one he did for Blue Thumb, and it was okay, but the second one, that was the one that had Room 335 and all that, and so that and all I think it was Lee Ritenour First Course, and then all those Rit records. So there was actually a thing for a while, and it didn't quite catch on, in Nashville, but there was a thing where, if you were a studio player in LA, somebody would come and say, "Hey, let's make a record."
Yeah.
So there were all of these really interesting, kind of instrumental records in the 70s. And of course, this is kind of like heavily in the yacht rock era. This predates all the metal stuff,
Yeah. Yeah. Man, that's a really interesting time, and a lot of those like Larry Carlton records and stuff I kind of picked up later, after that whole, because I was too young to be into that stuff at that point in time. But yeah, you're right, man. The music industry used to support excellent musicianship, and some of those records did pretty good numbers, man. As far as of course, you got George Benson, who crossed over,
Yeah.
And
But yeah, and even like Stanley Clark, because when they did the record, I guess it was probably might have been the first record that he did on Emperor, which was Epic Records. And they were like, it's a bass player, and all of a sudden it started getting legs and taking off and getting played on FM rock. And then when School Days came out, that just went, that was totally nuts. And so I remember going to Dallas to see Stanley with his band with a great guitar player named Ray Gomez.
Yeah.
And he's actually, let's hear it for social media, because Ray and I can, as we say in the South, we can get on the Facebook and talk.
Yeah.
But, because he's living in New York, but it was Ray and his band. He had this really incredible band. And then the opening act was John McLaughlin and the One Truth Band.
Wow.
With I think Sunship, Woody Theus on drums. I believe it was probably, I'm trying to remember the keyboard. I think it was Stu Goldberg on synth, and it was T.M. Stevens on bass guitar.
Wow.
TM was just absolutely incredible. So yeah, that was, and a few months later, I was in, at the same concert venue, and the band was UK with Allan Holdsworth and Clifford and all those guys. And then the opening act was this guy that I knew from Austin, who had a kind of a bad management deal, and he just could not get a deal. But he was a bubbling under guy, a guy named Eric Johnson. And so Eric did the opening act, and it took me years to even hear any of that stuff he played that night, because they eventually released it as the Seven Worlds album. But what happened is he was managed by the same guy that managed ZZ Top, Bill Ham. And that's, sometimes you got to be careful with management, because they'll kind of sign you and then put you in their pocket.
Yeah.
It's like, that's real good, man, but that's a little too close to this other thing we have. So I'll give you some money and put you aside. And
yeah. They can sign you and shelve you.
That's right.
And I've had a few people in the comments before that say they've had similar situations where they sign with a label or they sign with something, and then all of a sudden they realize, hey, we sound just like one of their other acts, but their other act is already something that's a priority for them. And so they sign you just to put you on the shelf, basically, man.
Well, yeah, and I think in the case of that, one of the things that was going on was, this was about, when he was signed to Bill, and Eric would probably be the better one to answer that. That was right during the time he was managing ZZ Top, and ZZ Top was blowing up because they Eliminator and all these kind of the 80s MTV video stuff. So eventually what happened with Eric is he got out of that deal, I think about 84. the beginning of '85, and by '86, Tones was out, and all of a sudden he was a guy. All of
Yeah.
a sudden, he
Yeah.
was doing tours and whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was that era, and I don't want to be like the old guy yelling in a cloud, but that era was different as
Yeah.
far as just the level of musicianship.
Yeah, and the combination of songwriting, the production, it's a different thing when you create magic in a room together as opposed to flying tracks around. Now, I like flying tracks around as much as the next guy now because I don't want to have to move all my stuff into somebody else's studio. But man, back then those records it's like you can hear the vibe in the room.
Right, right. You're absolutely right. I was last night. This is like a Saturday. We're talking. The Friday, I was down in Muscle Shoals doing a thing for the WC Handy Jazz Festival or Music Festival down there. It was kind of like a jazz masters thing. And one of my dear friends is a guy named um, oh gosh, 69-year-old brain. Wait, help! Let me get it out. Uh, Bob.
Bob Babbett.
No, I knew Bob, and Bob was Bob Ray. Yeah, yeah, Bob Ray. I did know Bob Babbett. That's another story.
Yeah.
But Bob and I, and Bob had like a really huge studio career in Muscle Shoals, and he moved up to Nashville, and he played on the Highwayman record. He played on he played on Seven Spanish Angels, I think, with Willie Nelson and Ray Charles. He had done really, really heavy stuff. And he was just finishing up I guess it was last week, the remnants of the Charlie Daniels band is doing a recut of a lot of stuff where they're redoing a lot of the musical stuff around Charlie's vocals.
Wow.
And I guess Charlie Hayward didn't want to do it, and so Bob was doing it. And we talked about that same thing too, and he's talking even down in Muscle Shoals, you run into younger players and it's like they don't quite understand why they're doing what they're doing. So it's like if somebody says, the only music I listen to, and Bob was telling me about this, he said that one kid told him really straightforward, the only music I ever listened to was cut on a precision bass. I'm like, oh, really? That's
a bold statement.
That's a presumption, and I'm like, oh, okay, here's a P bass. Now I want you to play What's Going On.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like people get into the iconography of this stuff.
Yeah.
Where it's like, oh yeah, well it's this, but the reality of it is that there's a whole subterranean thing of why music sounds the way it does.
Yeah.
And I'm going to put my teacher's hat on for a second. But, one of the books that I have my students go through as freshmen at Belmont is Standing in the Shadows of Motown. For one thing, the parts are really hard to read. So if you can read through those, anything that you get, if somebody puts something in front of you and you have to read it on a gig or in a studio or whatever, then you're not going to be scared. Yeah. And I'll tell them, hey, this is how you can be a successful pop or soul or studio bass player. But the thing you got to do now is you got to play about half the notes that Jamerson did. But the thing about Jamerson, when you start looking at it really close, is he's playing jazz upright lines.
Yeah.
And he's editing them, and he's playing them with, kind of like R&B and funk sensibilities. So it's a different animal. But one of the things that Bob was talking about was that these people with these opinions, like, a lot of them, they've never sat in a room to make a record.
Yeah.
Or if they have sat in a room to make a record, what's happening is you got the one guy in the control room and he's looking at the screen. He's not listening. Yeah. He's looking at the screen. He's like, well, I'm going to have to move that bass note over because it's just a little bit to the side of the kick drum when you're going, well, wait a minute, man. If it's kind of like the Rolling Stones. There's a really famous or infamous Rick Beato where he quantized, I think, the Stones, and he quantized John Bonham through Beat Detective, and it's horrible.
It ruins it.
It's the worst, because part of that thing is, and once again, this is one of those things you can't learn except by just logging the flight hours, is that one of the things is that great music a lot of times is not totally in time agreement. I mean, I guess the classic case is the Rolling Stones. There's like 3 times going at all time.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's like Keith's out in front, and Charlie Watts is kind of in the back, and Bill Wyman's in the middle trying to kind of knit it all together, and it kind of lurches along, but that's what makes them sound like that.
Yeah, that's a lesson, man, that kids don't get now, because everything is snapped to grid. They don't have the concept of, wait a minute, what if the bass player plays a little behind the beat intentionally to get that kind of that feel, that little bit of push and pull with the drums, and then the guitar player's funk playing is going to be slightly on top of the beat, and that creates that between the drums maybe sitting in the middle somewhere, the bass pulling a little bit slightly on the backside, and the guitar having that agitated sort of rhythm on top, is going to create an incredible feel, that push and pull that makes people move, as opposed to this everything gets eliminated when it's all on the same strike. If you were to record, because here's the deal, if everything's on the grid, it's like burying the click all day. It's cool if that's what you're practicing to do, but as far as feel goes, it's just a machine.
Right. And that's not, we've all talked, and you've talked about this on your channel, but, a huge topic of conversation right now is AI generation of music. And one of my friends had a good point with that. I do some records for him, and we were doing one of his tracks, and he said, you know what? The weirder I make it, the less likely I'm going to be able to be copied by AI. Because, so I think that there's a lot to be said for, there's, if anything, I think in the best case scenario, what'll happen is it'll push people back into playing in real time, and, writing things together in a room and playing things together in a room. I think that will very likely happen, on some, especially with the kids, because the kids kind of grew up around everything being, with its hair nicely combed by a snap to grid. But just like any other kid, they're going to look at it and go, I don't want to do that. That's the way that mom and dad's music sounds.
Yeah.
That's Beyonce. I don't like Beyonce. I'm going to do this weird stuff that we're doing over here.
Yeah. Maybe it'll be some form of rebellion, like you said, but it is a shock when and I've cut stuff on the floor with everybody there, and that is a like a Nashville session, that if you haven't done that before, people think a Nashville session is easy, and that's because they haven't done it. And it doesn't matter that the song's only got 4 chords that repeat, and then the bridge just has a couple extra chords thrown in, and that's it. I mean, it's like Kenny Aronoff describing how he's literally got, from walking from the room after hearing the demo and walking to his drums, he's got that much time to figure out, what the hell am I going to do?
That's true. And you know, when I first moved there, I'd actually done some session work in Miami, and I'd done some session work in Dallas. But it was always like, here's your bass part, you know, read this, you know. So I was just reading music. But when I got to Nashville, the very first thing that I noticed was that nobody was handing me music. There would be a guy with a guitar, and he'd be going, and I'd be like, "Oh, nice, a little concert." And I realized that what we really needed to do, what they expected us to do, was to write out a number chart. So the very first thing that I realized was the best place to be when you were writing on a number chart was right by the keyboard player, because they knew the voicings.
Yeah.
So I'd be over there and just copy the guy. And you know, and the tricky thing about it is that yeah, you have the song arrangement, but then you have to create your own parts. And, you know, if they're too pedestrian, that's not going to work and you're not going to get called back. And if they're too busy, you're going to step all over the singer, and that's not going to work and you're not going to get called back. You have to find that sweet spot where it's like, you know, I'm going to do these little, you know, thinking from the point of view of a bass player, I'm going to do these little slides in, or I'm going to figure out where I need to pedal eighth notes, or, you know, even something like those really, really old school. And I did a lot of custom records when I first got here, you know, where it's all just like, you know, root fifth oriented stuff. And with that, when you're doing the really old Nashville stuff, what you do as a bass player is you totally double the keyboard player's left hand.
Wow.
To the point where it's like, you know, you know, there's certain formula things that you do as a bass player, like Bob Moore, who was like the most, I think he actually is the most recorded bass player in history. He did so many sessions here. But Bob came up with this thing where when you go to the four chord, you just repeat the root, because if you're, let's say you're in the key of C, you know, and you're doing root fifth, then you go to F. If you do root fifth, you're going to be playing a C. Well, you've already played the C. It's the root of that last, and it's a small thing, but it totally makes sense. And it's one of those things that is real idiosyncratic about Nashville. A lot of, you know, it seems like about the first 3 or 4 years, I was just driving myself crazy trying to figure out how it all worked and what part of the drum set to listen to, and what kind of sound and what kind of, you know, how I played. And of course, when you got a rock and roll gig like I did with Joanna Dean, all that stuff goes out the window.
Yeah.
There was, you know, so there was, you know, I wish I had been around to do the record, but I got hired after the record. I was kind of like the Rudy Sarzo in this particular piece.
Yeah.
And the two bass players who were on the record were Willie Weeks, who
Wow.
I actually knew Willie because he came. This is really humbling, and I, you know, if I say this the wrong way, it'll make me sound like some jerk. But he actually came to me for bass lessons because Dave Rowe referred him to me, and I was like, oh my gosh, what can I show you?
Yeah.
You know, because I've been listening to that guy, you know, since Donny Hathaway Live. And, you know, you can always show people something.
Yeah.
Because as a good teacher, if you have a very, very good, and actually, you know, I'm doing it right now. I'm taking a few lessons with Stu Ham and with Brian Bromberg. And both those guys, you know, it's kind of like, they don't need to show me notes, but a lot of it's kind of like working with a tennis coach.
Yeah.
So like, well, you know how you're doing that during the backhand. Here, try this. You can clean this up, or maybe a golf pro.
Yeah.
You know, you're those kind of guys can come in and they can bring nuance. You know, they can see things that you're doing that you're not seeing. Now, you know, in the case of Willie, it was a very specific thing. He's like music theory, and I'm like, I got that, man. I got you. But the other guy was David Cochran, and Dave played on a bunch of stuff. Shout out to Dave Cochran. He's a great bass player. He played with Robert Johnson, not the blues guy, but the young rock and roll guy from Memphis, and Rob Junclays, and I think he was on maybe a John Kilzer record or two, and he was playing. He was a great bass player, and he it was one of those things where when a small scene like Memphis, kind of contracts, everybody's got to figure out what else to do. Nashville's big enough to where that doesn't happen. But at a certain point in the end of the 80s, early 90s, Memphis kind of collapsed. And so Dave actually ended up getting a second career and becoming I think he's an anesthetist's nurse. So he works with like an anesthesiologist, and I think he's even over at Vanderbilt. I don't know. He moved to town, but this is the guy that played all this really, really cool bass stuff on all these records. But as it's like if you're going to be in this for a long haul, you're going to go up and down. You're going to have some really good years, and you're going to have some really bad years.
Yeah. And that segues well into talking about living and dying by your calendar.
Oh my gosh.
Right. I know you can relate to that because, there's, and a guy we used to know, Scat, would always say January, February, because we would be like, hey man, you got anything? No, we haven't got anything. I'm like, oh man. And you would just learn, here's what you would hope, that you had a good December. And it used to be Christmas parties would be the thing, for at least for me. And I would do enough of those that would get me through January. And then by January, maybe a couple things drop, or maybe something good happens and you get a few gigs. And because even the touring and stuff like that, a lot of it really kind of shuts down.
Nobody starts again until March. Yeah, that actually brings up an interesting point. When I was with Joanna Dean and we were going to New York and LA and shooting videos and all that, I think my draw was like $200 a week.
Wow.
And so it was not much. That's like, you can't keep a bird alive on that if you're a 19-year-old.
So what year? This was 87, and you're making $200 a week.
Okay, but yes, there was, the record company was paying us $200 a week draw, or a retainer.
Yeah.
And then we made more when we went on tour. It wasn't much, but the thing is that what you were talking about. I worked a New Year's Eve gig this was when I had joined Joanna Dean. We'd already taken the pictures and, we'd shot the video and all that. But I remember I worked New Year's Eve that year in 87 into 88. I had my hair tied back in a ponytail. I was wearing a tuxedo and I was playing in a big band because it didn't matter. I had a house payment to make. I had a son and a stepdaughter and a wife to take care of. And, I was kind of like, everybody always talks about how George Lynch had to be like, he had to keep his hair cut short,
driving a truck. He was driving a beer truck.
Because you have to, you got to take care of your family. So I was really lucky because I had, a part-time college teaching job because it was part-time back then. And then I also took as many private students as I could. And the other thing is I was not above, putting on a suit and tie and tying my hair back or wearing a tux, tying my hair back. Because I'd been doing tux gigs since I was, 18 years old. So it was like, this is just one more thing I can do. And so I didn't care, Now that led to some funny moments because there was a time where I was over in the UK and we were having a dinner with the Polygram record people. And there was a really pretty young blonde lady and we were talking. And she said, well, my husband's a bass player. He's recorded with Nick Kershaw and Howard Jones and all these people. I don't know who it would be. But I said, oh my gosh, I'd love to meet him. And she said, oh, you'd have nothing in common. He's a proper muso. And I was like, what? I'm sitting there with like the dog collar.
He assumes, yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't know. Maybe they thought I, had I was just like a metalhead or something. Yeah. And I was like, what? Well, I'm a proper muso.
Yeah. Yeah. You get pigeonholed, in this business. And that has got to be, I know that feeling of, I just did some huge rock thing or I just did some TV show, or I did this, and now here I am in a tuxedo, with my hair pulled back or whatever, and I'm playing My Girl.
Right.
And I'm going like, man, I was just like literally rolling in a limousine, and there were swarms of girls, and it was like this, wild party afterwards and all that. And now here I am, I'm playing, for 200 or 300 bucks, playing the Schwarz's wedding, you know.
But you know what? I'm often fond of quoting to my students, Kroger doesn't care where that dollar comes from. It's like when you go through the checkout, they don't go, "Oh, great, good to see you, Mr. Vogt. Now, are these hip dollars,
Yeah.
or are they cornball dollars? Because a hip dollar is worth like 50% more than like My Girl. So
Yeah.
if it's a Rock Tour dollar, it's worth no one cares. So and that was probably the one thing that kind of saved me, because there was a lot of, when I was going through that, and we were making a very minimal amount of money on our retainer. And I remember the drummer was like, well, man, I know it's tough, but why don't you declare bankruptcy? We're all going to be millionaires in the next year. And I'm like, you don't know how this works, do you?
Yeah.
Because, that ended up, the way that a lot of times a deal will work is that, and once again, this is something that and a lot of your followers and listeners know, is that yes, if you get like $750,000, by the time it passes through the hands of the lawyers and the manager and the producer and all that money that they spend on the videos, which is, you're bankrolling all this stuff.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you can have a $750,000 record deal, and the band might, if they're lucky, get like 50 to 35,000 to split between them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or even less, man.
Oh yeah. Well, I was on the even less. I was I was on the even less, which is,
and the deals got progressively lower and lower as the years went on. In the 80s, there was that period where, the $500,000 record deal, that was dangled, like a carrot.